Pandang Briara, we Bandang Mortaman, Ninin Dedinal, Balapwanki, Ngala Malangara, Echina Bal, Pulanga Yira, Yanga Kwaba, Nicha Yok, Nian, Bora Kol, Nonang Kalamaya, Ngal Bal, Burda Echina, Mokin, Rachel Welia, Nian Danju, Yirba, Mortaman, Israeling. Bolanga Yira, Buddha, Yanga, Nuneng, Warda Karak, Ephatha Kal, Kiji, Yanga, Nuneng, Kul Kumba, Bethlehemal. Bolanga Yira, Buddha, Yanga, Nuneng, Bula, Kolanga, Nija, Yok, Murdiyayo. Ngal, Nonang Morta, Buddha, Etina, Moking, Murta, Perezeng, Ngin, Taima, Yidya, Judayak.
Well, good morning, church. It's great to be here to share continuing our series on the Gospel of Ruth that we've been doing here at Live Streams. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on your phone, on your iPad, or in your lounge room, or wherever you are today. It's great that we can still connect and join. You usually do know I'm speaking here, and it's not a Beyond Sunday, because usually I cover the school holidays so that others can join up, and I know that I'm not booked for talks with my Bible Society talk often during school holidays, so I always am great. But I'm so excited that the room is so full, even with the middle week of school holidays and it being sunny and such nice weather here in Perth. I'm so glad that you were able to join us to hear this continuing series, which I've been particularly excited about. Ruth has become one of my favorite books of the Bible. And I'll unpack a little bit of you, and you'll see a bit of glimpse of why it's so significant to me. But it's such a phenomenal book, and I'm excited to take us to chapter 4 of Ruth today. I wonder, do you know your family story? Your story of origins, if you will. Has anyone done those ancestry tests online? I forgot what it's called, where you kind of go and you figure out that kind of knee-deep research. So a few of you have. It's fascinating to me. I haven't done one myself, but I know another member of my family has, and we were thinking about doing it together, and we haven't done it. Gives you a glimpse of the story of where you've come from. I find these interesting, especially later in life. I'm not sure, as a boy growing up in the States in America, a white kind of middle-class family, that I cared very much about the generations that came before me. I'm sure the reality of this is very mixed in this room. Some of you, particularly if you did that test, can maybe go back generation after generation after generation and know the names of your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents and your great-great-great-great-grandparents, where you've come from, what journey brought you to Australia, and what the journey of your background of wherever home country you come from overseas. Whereas some of you might really not know much beyond your grandparents. And even some of you might have a different biological story, whether you're adopted or fostered, and you might not even know much about your biological parents or grandparents. It could be a very mixed sort of reality with that in this room. And I've done a little bit of the research for me, but I certainly can't point back very far other than some geographical areas. And a couple years ago, I actually looked at the records of Ellis Island in the United States, because my ancestors came to America from parts of Europe and Italy, and looked through the names, and you can see the actual signatures of people in those kind of records. And I think you can do something very similar with the ancestry records in Australia. And so why does that matter? Why does our family story, our family origin matter? I think for many of us living in the Western world, it may not matter a lot, because our identity is not often exclusively tied in to our family origin. But sometimes it is. It's a very mixed story. Now, I've got a funny story about family origin for you. My youth pastor growing up had one of these funny family origin experiences. He was dating and was about to be engaged to a woman, and they were having this conversation about their family backgrounds and where they come from, which is an interesting thing to do when you're young and sort of, mixing with families, especially when you come from, interstate. My youth minister came from Texas originally, but he lived in Chicago for a few years when he was working with me in the youth group. And he always had this interesting kind of trivia. I don't know if any of you have this interesting trivia where you can point back and say, I'm related to this mildly famous person, or maybe very famous person. Some of you might have that. Well, he had an interesting one. He had always said the story that through his lineage, he was related to Jefferson Davis. Now I'll pause, because most of you probably don't know who Jefferson Davis is, although some of you might. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, otherwise known as, in the Civil War, the South. So he was the president of the Confederacy. So he had this fun little trivia that he was related to Jefferson Davis from the Confederacy. So he decides in this conversation with his future fiancée to break out this interesting tidbit. Hey, did you know that I'm related to Jefferson Davis? And she laughs out loud and says, well, that's funny. I'm related to Jefferson Davis too. And they laugh at first at the irony, if that's what you want to call it. Now, I wasn't there. But somewhere in those moments, I'm sure their laughter turned into this kind of nervous laugh. And then this, hold on, how exactly are you related to Jefferson Davis? Wait, are we cousins? This could be a problem. This could be weird. Well, they did some research and found out that one of them was related through marriage, so they weren't blood related. And fast forward 2 decades later, they have 2 beautiful boys. None of them have any genetic abnormalities of any kind. So good on those 2. And I hope he doesn't stumble across this talk watching online as I share his anonymous story. But in the ancient world and in the time of the Bible, family origin and genealogy tell a great deal of your story, your history. It goes beyond just, I'm related to this famous person and I'm connected with it, but it said a lot about who you were. I don't know if you've even noticed this in stories of fiction. I've been pretty glued to the Rings of Power series on Amazon Prime. I don't know if some of you are into that, and I'm sure some of you may have positive or negative opinions on that, but it's the prequel to the Lord of the Rings movies. This fascinating world that Tolkien created and talks about in his books. And like the ancient world, family origin tells an important story. Because when you watch a prequel series, it's really noticeable that you're paying attention that this person is an ancestor to this character that I know and understand. When in a series, when a young Isildur shows up, you know he's part of Aragorn's story. You're paying attention to these little details and realities. Wait a minute, how is this connection here? How are they connected? You can sense this probably in other TV series and movie series. You sense it even in Star Wars, where when you go back in time and you're watching episode 1 of the movie that came out, a couple decades ago now, where you know this boy is going to turn into this. So you pick up these little details and you're looking for how is this movie maker or filmmaker going to tell the story of the ancestor of Darth Vader. And if we go back to the Bible, this helps to describe why genealogies are so important. There's actually a decent percentage of the Bible that is genealogy. This person begat this person, begat this person. It's probably the part you skip over. You might read it. I'm sure Dave reads the genealogies as he goes through his Bible readings, but in some cases we skip over it. We don't notice it. But they are so important to the ancient world. They tell us who a person is, what their links are, what their family origin is, and how that makes them who they are as a person. It would probably be worth thinking of it in our society the way we think about education. If you have a degree from a prestigious medical institution, that says a lot about your expertise as a doctor or a medical professional. One of my friends studied at Oxford. That says a lot about his expertise and his intelligence. If you have a degree from Oxford, I don't know exactly what it is, but you must be pretty switched on and smart and intelligent to get that kind of degree. I sometimes tell people, well, I have an undergraduate degree from a Christian Reformed, somewhat conservative university, and a master's degree from the Tony Campolo School of Social Change, which is a more left-leaning theological degree. So that tells you a bit of a story about me. I'm kind of over here, but I'm kind of over here. And in my role with Bible Society, it fits really well because I can speak in most theological contexts and circumstances. It says a little bit about who I am and how God has wired me. And so for you, your education or your pursuit of education might say a lot about who you are. It doesn't say everything, but it tells a story. I'll admit that's a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it's helpful for us to see how the Bible would have looked at things. The family story in the Bible serves very similar ways. Whose knee did you learn from? Who taught you? What are your family connections? What's your family background? Because that's going to tell people in the ancient world a little bit, probably a lot, about who you are. You can actually see this role play out in the Bible in both directions. Do you remember when Jesus went into the temple and spoke from the scroll? And the verse in the Bible in Luke tells us that all spoke well of him and were amazed at his gracious words that came from his mouth. But do you remember what they said next? They said, "We're hearing these amazing words, but isn't this Joseph's son? He's not supposed to be that. He's a carpenter. Or he's this. How is this son of Joseph speaking so graciously in this context?" They couldn't get past this strong cultural reality. You are what your family is, what they made you. And that takes us to Ruth, this fascinating story of family and family origins, where we've been taken into this world of Naomi, the Israelite woman who found herself outside of her homeland at the beginning of Ruth in Moab with a husband and sons who married foreign women. So they have a very mixed story. Their family origins are a bit complicated. You see this in other parts of the Bible where this sort of tainting from other lands is actually very complicated in family life and family circumstances. And so Naomi is living in a foreign land, now coming back to Israel, but has this foreign daughter-in-law, Ruth. At a personal level, I and some of you might resonate with the story a little bit. I know what it's like to marry someone from a foreign land and find yourself living in a land and a country that's not yours. Some of you might feel this tension in your cultural life, where you have completely different cultural expectations and realities of how you interact with the world, especially those of you that are in marriages where there's kind of a Western reality and a non-Western reality. I've talked with couples in this reality, and you can feel that tension all the time. I had a chance to go back to Chicago recently, my hometown, to smell the smells and to hear the noises, and there's something powerful about homeland, about home country, and I never really felt it until the last few years when I've had some interactions with some of my Aboriginal brothers and sisters in New York country, where we're driving down a road and they know every single tree, every single blade of grass, every single pathway, this strong connection to country and land and flora and fauna they had. It actually made me reconnect with my land the last 2 times I've been back to actually pay attention to the land that I come from, to the things that God had wired in me. And so we find ourselves in this book, in a story about family, where there's this interesting connection to the land and the country that they live in. But for Naomi, her story is not just about land and country. It's about pain and trauma and difficulty. Naomi was the one at the beginning of the book who labeled herself bitter because she has been through some big-time family trauma. She's lost the men in her life, the people that she loved. That was her family, completely disconnected. Now she's isolated and alone. Encouraging that Ruth came with her, but she's lost her family. She's lost much of the investment that she made in her life for generations had died. Some of you might know about this family trauma in ways that I could never understand. You feel this bitterness, this pain. I think the book of Ruth is giving us permission to feel this. The Bible gives us permission to call ourselves bitter and frustrated and angry with God. So I do want to pause here. If you are feeling the pain of loss, or the pain of family conflict, or the pain of dispossession that family can sometimes bring, I want to say it's okay to feel that pain. It's okay to say, as Naomi did, call me Mara, because God has made my life bitter. The Bible dedicates entire psalms and even books of the Bible to call out to God in bitterness. It's okay. Mel mentioned last week in her series on Ruth last week that the season of mourning that Ruth was in, and how she would have been wearing the kind of outfit that signifies that she was still in mourning for the loss of her husband. And while some people in the Bible will tell you that the period of mourning in the Bible is 7 days or 30 days, in actual fact, we see sometimes where a period of mourning goes on for a while. And so Mel did a great job of unpacking the scene in chapter 3 where Ruth took off her mourning outfit and moved to the next stage of what God had called her and what Naomi had been involved in calling her to. So if you are in mourning, there is no time frame. There's no hard and fast rule. There are different circumstances. And I propose that a mourning time is more about God's work through the circumstances of your life and less about a specific time frame that works for everyone. There will be a time, like in Ruth, where God will call you to a new life, to new circumstances, and where your mourning will turn to dancing. But that's on your time frame, between you and God, your trusted friends and confidants in your life. To not go through mourning alone, to work with people around you, but to go at the pace that God has set for you in the time of mourning. I felt quite strongly yesterday to encourage anyone in this room who needed to hear that in your season of mourning. But there is hope. Because in the midst of Naomi's bitterness, she had a plan, and God had a plan. And in this plan, in Ruth, it would change not just Naomi, not just Ruth, not just her children, but thousands of generations leading up to us. And it centers around the role of this guardian redeemer. The King James Version calls it a kinship redeemer. The Noongar English calls it a right way man. And this role was part of Mosaic law. It defined a redeemer as a male, near-blood relative who had the responsibility for rescuing, protecting, and helping weaker relatives. This could be financial, buying back the land for relatives who had lost it and been forced to sell it. It could be legal, defending the victimized. Or it could involve adopting or taking into family kids or spouses who had had loss. Boaz's role as a right-way man injects even more hope into the story. This isn't just some guy Naomi is trying to set up with Ruth. He holds a special role and a special responsibility. You could call him the right-way man. And I want to unpack this in terms of how Aboriginal Australians understand this role and understand family themselves. I learned some of this from a previous cultural training, but I cited much of this from the Evolves community website that I found earlier this week. And the Aboriginal English term for skin groupings. And this refers to traditional kinship and family structures that govern Aboriginal concepts of family. And all across Australia, Aboriginal people live around these sort of understood rules around who they could marry, who they could joke with, who they could speak with, who they could not speak with, and who you are socially obligated to care for, and so on. It's almost the early way of making sure that Jefferson Davis's grandkids don't marry each other. They had these different skin groupings of the way that they did that. And it serves how they relate to people. It's not about skin in the sense of the color of skin, but it was certain particular ways that they related to each other on a biological or a social basis. And under this system they'd set up, family includes biological and non-biological relatives, not just in-laws. They are considered just as important as blood relatives. It creates extended families, extended care structures. Their definition of family is much more broader than the Anglo-Australian or typical white way of doing things, where typically we tend to be very linear and collateral. It goes up and down and sideways to include siblings or distant relatives. But Aboriginal kinship is circular and generational. This is evidenced by the term that Aboriginal people use for grandparents and their grandparents' siblings. We distinguish between grandparents and grandparents' siblings, whereas Aboriginal people do not. Grandparent siblings are considered the same as one's biological grandparents and are also called grandmother or grandfather, as opposed to grandaunt or granduncle. And they make no distinction between first cousins and siblings, referring to them as brothers and sisters. And there's different words that they use where everyone is kind of cousins, auntie, uncle, grandfather, in a very wide understanding of family within these skin grouping definitions that they do. And I could spend an hour talking about this, and I really don't want to, because I want to let Aboriginal people tell their story and you to let their research speak for themselves. But in a basic 101 concept, you have these right way and wrong way relationships, where everything's understood of who you can interact with and who you can't interact with. I was at a training one time, and the guy was explaining to me that there was this family out in the bush, and they knew who they could interact with. And there was a mother-in-law and a son-in-law who could not interact, and they knew it. And so she's in the house, and she needs firewoods, and she plops out to the front. The son-in-law's, I don't know, somewhere out in the bush somewhere. She pops out and says, I need some firewood. Doesn't say it to anyone in particular, just sort of says it out into the distance. And then later that day, there comes the firewood on the ledge, sort of where they were. And they couldn't really interact directly, but there was an understanding of what roles people played. It's fascinating, actually, to look into. And if you haven't done one of those cultural trainings, I very much encourage you to do that. So different parts of the family have different responsibilities. And it wasn't just about who you could marry, but who you are obligated to care for and who you are obligated to not even speak to. So Boaz is a right-way man. That's the way it's translated in the Noongar. We'll hear that again in a second. And this is why this story resonates so strongly. We Western folk might look at this story and think, this is kind of weird. Mother-in-law setting up a daughter-in-law with some type of distant employment with a relative who may be a relative, who may not be a relative, who's kind of connected in a weird way. And in a world where we choose our partner and our family in some ways, and we are very focused on the immediate family, this story can be culturally unfamiliar to us. But to non-Western folks who I've read this story with before, it actually makes perfect sense. Of course, the right-way man steps in. He's family. Not family in a genetic way, but in an obligation, caring kind of way. And lucky for him, he also is right way in a way that he can marry this woman. But here's how the whole story comes together. Because it's not just a story about Boaz, about Naomi, about Ruth. It isn't just a story about family or obligation or biology or marriage. This story is about to echo through eternity. I want us to read this. I want us to hear Cindy Moody in Noongar read this again. And I want you to read along the Noongar English. And I'm going to repeat it after this video because I want you to resonate how this story echoes through eternity and echoes to us today.
Karo bandang beriara we bandang mortaman nyinin dedinau balapwanki ngala malangara etchina bal pulanga yira yanga kwaba nichayok ngiyan bora kol nonang kalamaya ngal bal burda etchina mocking Rachel welia ngiyan Danju Yirba Mortaman Israeling Bolanga Yira Buddha Yanga Nuneng Warda Karak Ephitha Kal Kiji Yanga Nuneng Kol Kumba Bethlehemal.
We can actually stop there if you want.
Buddha Yanga Nuneng.
And I'll stop it right there because I want to highlight this part, this big name in Bethlehem. If we just flick the slide back one. If that's possible. It may not be. I've got it here. I actually want to read it fame and give you a big name in Bethlehem. Make your name famous in Bethlehem. And here's how the NIV says it. These are the witnesses of the marriage, or the relationship, of the transaction, if you will, of Boaz and Ruth, and later on Naomi, which I think Brian will speak about next week. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing and be famous in Bethlehem. May you have a big name in Bethlehem. And your offspring as well. That's that next slide if we go forward to that part if we can. May your offspring be famous as well, to give you many children. Now, I probably don't need to tell you, it doesn't say it there, it hints at it later, who the offspring of Ruth is. Remember, Ruth's a Moabite, foreign, dispossessed woman, not connected in Israel other than through marriage, who finds her way into God's story. Because Ruth is the father of Obed. And Obed is the father of King David. The generation points to King David, which means that the genealogy in Matthew of Jesus mentions Ruth. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. That's what it's mentioned in Matthew in the genealogy. That Jesus' great-great-great-great-grandmother, this Israelite man, who the genealogy's purpose is to point to his special place in Israel and special place in the tribe of King David, points back to Ruth. It's part of the reason we call this series the Gospel of Ruth, the good news of Ruth, because it translates down to Jesus and then transcends to all of us, that we are children of God. Not by birthright, not by the sort of narrative of the day where you had to be connected in order to be part of family. We are all the children of God, and that comes from, in some ways, the faithfulness of Naomi, the woman who at the beginning of the book said, "Call me bitter." And God redeems her family through this guardian redeemer, this right way man of Israel, this faithful man and faithful mother-in-law and faithful Moabite woman become part of Jesus' story and become part of our story. To me, it's quite a remarkable thing that we read in this book. And I don't know necessarily how that speaks to you. And for some of us, it may just be an interesting piece of trivia that Ruth is connected to Jesus. And maybe in their day, it was something that they looked past. Oh, whose mother was Ruth? Although I must say, and I say this often, that a woman being part of a genealogy in that day and age was completely countercultural in so many ways. that the lineage passed through the men, but there's a few women mentioned in the genealogy. One of them is Ruth. The other is the prostitute Rahab. These two foreign women who play such a vital role in the lineage of Jesus and the lineage of our faith. And some of that is through reading with some Aboriginal elders and people that I know, and reading that story and saying, of course, family takes care of family. And for you, your family might be the typical nuclear family where you've got your kids, you've got grandma and grandpa, you might have an uncle or two there, and that's okay. That's what God's called for your family. But maybe for some, that means expanding your family reach out and caring for the people in your family who might be on the outer edges of family. But for others, like you all, many of you know my story, it means bringing others into your family. And when you bring a child into your family, you sometimes bring the difficult parts of the family, of the biological parents, or the siblings of people that you foster or care for. But we know, as a family, that God's called us to. Family is not just the flesh and blood and genetics of what God has blessed us with, but family is the wider kingdom of God in our homeland. So whatever challenge that brings to you, I give to you. But I'm going to wind up and come to a time of prayer, because the biggest part of that for faith is also communion. That we are connected to the life and death and resurrection of Jesus through communion, through the legacy of people, that we are, in a sense, adopted into God's family. And this is the symbol of what that family looks like. This is our Christmas or Easter dinner, or Australia Day family gathering, or for me, this Thanksgiving gathering that happens in a few months. Whereas family, we come together. And we may not see each other every day, but we come together and we mark with our other brothers and sisters, our Catholic and Anglican, even our Baptist brothers and sisters, that we do this together. That this is what communion is about. That's the bread and the juice that links us with Jesus' death and resurrection, that we come together in. So I encourage you to pray together. Pray, in your heart and in your spirit. But even to spend some time as family, what is reflecting on what has Jesus done for us and for me. So let me close us in prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for our live streams family. Not just those in this room, but those on the screen as we watch, that we serve through our Beyond Mission family. Those outside the walls of this church that we serve through our community services and beyond local work that we do. For the many groups that use this building and facility that we call family here at Livestreams, I pray blessing. I pray for those who don't know Jesus very well, that this communion will be an opportunity for them to put their stake in the ground and say, I'm a part of God's family. For those of us who have been connected with God for all our lives, that we remember that this relationship then with God is not just about coming on Sunday and forgetting about it, but that communion links us together. It's a part of our lives. Be with any in this room who may be discouraged, that you give them hope and healing through your Son. And be with us as we continue our worship. In Jesus' name, amen.